Welcome to the Talking Transformation podcast, presented to you from the Western Cape Pod Bunker, located here in the heart of Cape Town, South Africa. This pod is presented to provide a platform and a voice for built environment professionals and interest groups who are working towards transforming the places and spaces here in South Africa. It is dedicated to those individuals and community groups that are supporting both the formal and informal processes that are shaping our cities and our spaces. In this episode of the Talking Transformation podcast, we bring you our most ambitious initiative yet. After 4 months of planning, the Talking Transformation podcast, in collaboration with the Architects, Planners, Engineers, Surveyor Society, APES Plus as it's known, brings you the inaugural Talking Transformation FutureCast episode. On Wednesday, the 22nd of January, over 60 guests gathered to listen to a diverse panel of built environment practitioners. In the hour and a half that followed, we reflected on 2019 as the year that was and started to look ahead to the rest of 2020 and in fact the next decade. In order of appearance, the panel comprised of Jodie Allemeyer from PricewaterhouseCoopers. As well as her work in the private sector, she's also a director for the Observatory Improvement District. She's recently been one of the fellows for the Global Public Policy Institute, and over 13 years she's gained experience within both the local government and private sector. She's passionate about the role of placemaking in social and economic development across cities and is a strong advocate for new, affordable housing models and economic inclusion. She was given the position on the panel of being the dreamer, the person who looks to the future and thinks about what's coming on the horizon. Professor Francois Viruli is the Associate Professor in Urban Economics, Property Development and Portfolio Management at the University of Cape Town. He also heads up the Urban Real Estate Research Unit, an innovation between UCT and Nedbank, and is a member of the Institute of the Directors of Southern Africa. Francois is a familiar voice, often being heard on the radio, media outlets, talking about the future of the South African property market and trends within the different cities around the country. His role on the panel, no surprise, providing the academic perspective. Elisabeth Varghese is a graduate intern about to conclude her work experience with the City of Cape Town. She is currently completing her MPhil in Sustainable Development at Stellenbosch University and has been one of the group of interns who have really demonstrated exemplary leadership and professional qualities in supporting, amongst other initiatives, the City of Cape Town's district planning process. She completed her schooling in Egypt and has been living in South Africa since 2014. For this role on the panel, she plays the role of the newbie, the new kid on the block. Barbara Southworth is an urban designer, spatial planner and architect who's practiced and taught in the public and private sectors for 26 years. She is an award-winning and widely published professional who has designed and implemented initiatives relating to public space, transit-orientated development, regeneration frameworks, to name but a few. A speaker very much in demand, she has travelled extensively in recent years and has been recognised in several urban design and spatial planning awards, including the International Ruth and Ralph Erskine Award. No surprise that we ask her to play the role of the experienced professional, the experienced hand. Regrettably, on the day, Wendafuna Ukwazi, represented by Mandisa Shandu, was unable to make the evening. She was unfortunately sick and we wish her a speedy recovery. In her place, in her stead, we were very fortunate to be able to call on the services of Lwazi Nobaza. Lwazi is a manager within the City of Cape Town within the Human Settlements Directorate. As well as his experience within the Human Settlement and Spatial Planning departments of the city, he also has first-hand experience of the Passenger Rail Agency of South Africa, or PRASA, in both the Eastern and Western Cape, giving him first-hand insight into the challenges as well as the opportunities afforded by commuter rail. He's extremely well read, is Lwazi. He has an MBA from Nelson Mandela Metropolitan University, is currently studying another Master's in Property Studies via the University of Cape Town. Replacing the activist view whilst working within the public sector is no small task, but I think you'll agree Lwazi did a great job in talking about from both perspectives, both the public sector as well as an activist's angle. So there you have it, that's the panel, and what you're going to hear now is the hour and 15 minutes of edited content. You're going to hear from 13 different voices, so it was quite a challenge using the low-tech recording environment to mix the voices. So sometimes some of the voices will be louder than others, some will be a bit clearer than others. I would ask you to bear with the quality as you go through the podcast, and I hope you enjoy the conversation and the debate that followed. We hear first from APE's chairperson, Ron Hayden.
I'm Ron Hayden, and I'm current chairperson of Architects, Planners, Engineers Society, plus 7 other professional disciplines that comprise the society called APES Plus. We are very happy to host you all here tonight. There are a number of new faces for which we are very glad, and I think that you may well have been drawn here by Pete's Talking Transformation podcast. I was listening to the 16th episode today, ex-Australia, and fascinating listening to people that I used to work with, and such a terrible loss to South Africa that people of that caliber have left, and I hope you all stay. We have 5 panelists plus Pete as the anchor and facilitator of the evening. He's the genius behind this collaboration. I'm really thrilled at the turnout, and I know that we're going to have an entertaining and informative evening tonight. And prepare yourself for question time. This is a safe environment. You can ask those difficult questions, but you can also be nice. I find that very difficult. Thanks, Pete.
Ron, thank you very much, and good evening, colleagues. This is an absolute thrill and a real privilege to be here. And to Ron and the APES committee, I first up want to say thank you very much for accepting the offer or the invite when I came knocking on your door. I think it was October last year. I said I've got this idea about how to close the year out, as it turns out, to start the year. And with your permission, with your collaboration, I think we can do something exciting at the beginning of the year. So here we are. But really, what is the purpose of tonight? What is this idea of a FutureCast? Well, in my experience, when I've listened to podcasts around the world, typically come the end of the year, there's a bit of a sort of a review, a think back on what have we heard, what have we seen. Talking Transformation podcast is only 6 months old. I say we're into 16 episodes already and trying to build a base, an archive of material with people in a network of professionals and activists around the country who can really start to provide us with some themes, with some answers, with some best practice. That's really what it's about. It's about a conversation. Nobody is going to be right all the time, and nobody's going to be wrong all the time. So I had thought to invite some new voices, people who we haven't heard from on the podcast early this year, to look back at what happened in 2019. I think 2019 was a tumultuous year for South Africa, a whole range of issues, not least of which the load shedding and the ESCOMs and SAA, all the parastatals. We can talk about that for the whole night. That's not what tonight's about. I thought about inviting people who could bring a particular perspective. So in our advertising of the event, we've talked about the academic and Francois Verly. Welcome, Francois. He's going to be providing us with, let's call it the academic, the rigor side of it. From the experienced professional, Barbara Southworth is known to most of you in this room, I'm sure. Been around for many, many years in both the urban design and the town planning worlds. Jody Alameyer, one of the young professionals who's making a lot of noise, really taking us forward in terms of what does the future hold. Currently working for PwC, but has an extensive background in the public sector, but also some of their NGOs and so forth. Elisabeth Varghese, one of our graduate interns at the City of Cape Town, a whole batch of about 6 or 8 of them this year who've really been shaking things up in the city and bringing some new ideas and reminding us older folk that there's different ways of doing this and different approaches, and really inspiring us. And I thought, Elisabeth, whether it's 1 year or 30 years of the rest of the panel, I'm as interested to hear from your side tonight. Mandisa Shandu, the director from Undafona and Kwasi, unfortunately this afternoon phoned in sick. She's unable to join us tonight. She sends her apologies. What I've undertaken is that through the Talking Transformation podcast, we will try and make a plan to speak specifically about the role of activists, whether it's NU, whether it's the Reclaim the City and Development Action Group. These are massively important voices within not only the city, but countrywide. So that's something we'll pick up with. And I'm absolutely indebted to my colleague Lwazi Nobaza for stepping in at literally, I think, the 11th hour. Something like 5:15 was it when I asked you, Lwazi. So many, many thanks. Lwazi spent the last 3 or so years with the City of Cape Town, working in the Spatial Development Planning Department, as well as now working directly on land issues with the Human Settlements Directorate, which has been newly re-established within the city. He's also got experience within the Passenger Rail Authority of South Africa, PRASA, and anybody living in Cape Town will know that PRASA is one of our big ticket issues. So these are the 5 people who have kindly donated their time and effort this evening, and I'd just like, before we start, to ask you to give them a round of applause for giving their time. The task that I asked each of our colleagues was to say, I want you to look back into 2019. I want you to consider what were the good, the bad issues. Who or what was your hero, and more importantly, what was your zero? And obviously, what were the reasons for that? And were there any particular lessons learned? We'll then move on into the future. What does 2020 hold? We're already almost a month down, and we know there's 101 things gone on in the last few weeks on returning from our festive breaks. So what is on your mind? What is it that you're thinking about? What are the themes that Ron and his APES team should be thinking about bringing into this space on a regular basis through their APES meetings? And what is it from a podcast point of view and material? What is it we should be thinking about going forward? And who is it we should be inviting into that space? The question is, what is the message that we're trying to get across, and how do we start to build understanding? So, Jody, would you kick us off on 2019? What you thought was the good, the bad, and the wholly indifferent? Thank you very much.
First, I just want to reflect on the being called the dreamer. I found that really difficult, to be honest, because last year was one of the most pessimistic and difficult years for me personally. So I really had to kind of go quite deep inside and figure out, where does this title kind of, how does it resonate, and how do I bring that into the room today? It's very popular to be kind of morally serious and critical and problematize everything at the moment. So it takes a lot to be the one who's putting on the table some optimism and some more kind of positive outlooks. In my work as a kind of a connector of dots and connector of people, I'm approached by a lot of dreamers. So a lot of the stuff that I put on the table this evening that's good and bad is actually a lot of people in the room, social entrepreneurs interested in township development, developers wanting to do something new, try something new, city officials who are trying to find a way and make a way despite all the chaos and changes, ordinary citizens on the street every day just trying to make connections, help their neighbor out, whatever it might be. And I think we lose that in the noise of all the negativity. Just in terms of kind of looking back on 2019, firstly, to just position it in terms of the broader kind of historical moment. Right now, we're kind of in the era of huge climate change being the major kind of threat and topic, and locally we've experienced that in a lot of our cities, and obviously Cape Town last year, 2019, we just emerged from the drought, and I think by now we've almost forgotten that we just avoided day zero and we've kind of gotten on with life. But globally, it's still a major trend. Technology and the impact of that on how we do business, how we communicate, how we tell stories, how we collect and store data. 5G is kind of around the corner. We've got this National Commission on 4IR, and nobody really quite understands where it's taking us and where it's going. But I think if we, in the future, look back on 2019, we might be able to see some things within that context that were quite key. Globally, there's the kind of, what I've seen some people call the kind of bro-fascists of the world, so that the Trumps, the Modis, the Bolsonaros, the Boris Johnsons, that obviously has had an impact on the kind of global mood, the global economy, investment into our country and others, the value of our currency, all of that kind of thing has an impact on our mood and our sentiment and how much we are dreaming versus how much we are having nightmares. Locally, politically, it was an election year, 2019, and 2020 is kind of pinned between a national and provincial election year and a local election year in 2021. So I think that's quite a key kind of defining issue for this topic of looking back and looking forward. And we emerged quite bumpily, still emerging from the Zuma era, and I think that has also had an impact. So good things that came out of that, I think some new shoots post-drought and post-Zuma. We've seen a kind of a re-emergence of some energy for some new topics on the table. Last year's SONA, we had urban issues in the agenda. Maybe not everybody agreed with how it was phrased and how it was said, but for a longest time we didn't really have cities as a major topic in the national agenda. So that was at least an opening to start a conversation and an invitation for professionals to start engaging with that. We saw a lot of emphasis on technology and skills development. The Jobs Fund initiated a huge investment in upskilling people and investing in digital skills development pipelines. terrible things happen from a gender perspective, but gender is now, in my experience, much more firmly on the table. Professionals are much more openly and explicitly discussing topics of gender and the safety of women in public spaces, on transport and planning, and for me that's a positive thing. We also saw a number of key court cases. Ndifuna Okwazi would have maybe spoken to some of those, but there were some successful court cases around rights to housing. Homeless people work together to take the City of Cape Town to court on the issue of being fined. The City of Cape Town itself is taking national government to court on whether or not they can procure independently electricity. So I think there's been a number of really groundbreaking court processes in 2019. And then there was also a lot of work to localize global trends. So I think for me, something really good from last year was the resilience strategies of Cape Town and Durban. They really put on the table some new ideas and new strategies and demonstrated that we do have the ability to participate in these kind of global agendas, but in ways that really make sense and meaning locally. The bad stuff, I think there's no shortage of things. Obviously, the economy is kind of rattling along like an old bantam bakkie, like the old economist Kees Bruggemans used to say. We had the army in some of our communities. We have an ongoing refugee crisis. There's been, I think, a sense of rising social instability. Obviously, public transport, the crumbling of Prasa, the closing of the line from Khayelitsha to Cape Town, the issues with gender-based violence, and Rieni's death at the post office that sparked the Am I Next movement. Ending the year with load shedding. I think that we can go on and on with these negative things. So I think my zeros in terms of 2019 were our responses to mobility and transport, urban management, and social stability. My heroes are the ordinary people that I've spoken about at the beginning, and I think actually some of my heroes are also the courts for 2019.
Jodie, thank you. What a fantastically comprehensive look back on 2019. Thank you for that. So if that was the dreamer's perspective, we're going to move on to the academic. Francois, follow that. Quite a comprehensive range of issues there. Anything that resonates, or are you coming from a different angle, or where you go?
A double period?
You have a double period, sir. You are the academic and the professor in the house.
Thank you very much. I will keep it short.
My first observation regarding last year is the ability of South African business to get through it. You know, we've been on a cyclical downturn since December 2013. This is now 74 months that we're in a cyclical downturn. Businesses can make it through 1, 2, 3. This is the longest cyclical downturn that the South African economy has seen since the Second World War. Now, the ability to get through that, the resilience of business to be able to get that, I think you won't find that in many places. Some will argue there was a lot of fat. Maybe there was a lot of fat. But so I think that would probably be my first observation. If I turn back to last year as well, and again from the perspective where I come, globally, I think there is a realization of the problems in the residential property market. I don't think it's just a South African story. The Economist on its front page this week put, why did we get it? How did we get it so wrong? I think it went along those sort of lines. That what we've been doing in the residential property market has not led. It was a bit of whoever was first in the game and managed to buy properties was there. We have a increasing group of people across the globe who just can't get anywhere close to the type of housing that they're looking for. And yes, we can say that it's an emerging country issue, but it's not. It's an issue from Berlin to across this continent as well. And I think that it is a year where the realization of the problems around the housing markets has come to the fore. And I think we will start seeing that as well. I am increasingly seeing investors who would never have looked at the commercial, at the residential property market, suddenly turning to that. Yesterday I took my master's student for a bus ride, and largely we were at the urban edge. Whether we've made mistakes there, we can have a debate about, but I think on some developments, the moment you touch that hill, you're in Stellenbosch. I think, the urban sprawl that this is going to lead to without a public transport system. It's something that we will regret going forward. And so I think it was the year that we spilled over, and go as you wish. Put in the infrastructure, whether you put it in or somebody else or whatever. But I think that comes to me as what I would certainly have perceived from last year. It was also the year where we started questioning. I think we had high hopes on blockchain technology. By now, all our title deeds, everything would be on the blockchain there. Maybe people weren't that interested to read on their bottle of milk in the morning the name of the cow that gave that milk. And I suppose blockchain can tell you whether it was Daisy or someone else. But maybe that didn't interest people as much. So I think that there's still the Wild West, but that Wild West is moving. It is the year in which and again, property markets that I certainly follow, the techies have moved into the property market. The whole group of people with no real estate background whatsoever, zilch, have entered the market and are seeing the opportunities in those markets. So it will be, and we're starting to see it, it will be the start. And what I always say, it took the Hilton Hotel 150 years to get to 600 rooms in 88 countries. It took Airbnb 5 years to achieve the same. And that speed of what we're going to see. The only problem with technology is that it can, and that's where we need to be careful, and we're starting to see the signs of that. We may leave some people behind us. Who it will serve will be, of course, technology is not neutral in any form. Where do you think things went wrong? They went wrong on transport. If we are going to build the way we're going to build, and we're going to put people at the fringes of our city with the public transport that we're dealing with at the moment. Yes, the attempts of Cape Town, the My City bus service system has played a role. Eskom has played its role, but as you said, let's not spend time on that. The other thing which I interacted with much last year, and team at UCT, the Urban Real Estate Research Unit, is starting to look at the nighttime economy. We often put looking from an economic perspective, a spatial dimension to it, but we rarely look at the economy from a time perspective when it happens. And I think I was totally amazed. Who's in the nighttime economy? The size of it. What happens at 11 o'clock at night when call centers switch in our city center with people trying to get home at midnight, 1 o'clock. Enormous gender issues in the nighttime economy. It is at the moment an economy that largely serves males, either from safety and other perspective, a transport perspective. And that is something, I think we're starting to get a realization of what's happening there. But I think there's a lot more to be done. Okay.
Francois, thank you. Moving on, we're asking our newbie, the new kid on the block. Elisabeth, you've been with the city now for a year. You've been studying prior to that, and you're going to be studying the year ahead. What was your experience in the course of the last 2019?
My experience was actually a roller coaster, basically. We were in a exciting year with a lot of ups and downs, but also just joining the city at a time when there was many policies and strategies that were just being initiated. So it was a big learning curve for all of us interns. And that feeling, I don't know, I just couldn't think of the words of that feeling of coming from being a full-time student, conceptualizing things on paper, to then really dive into the working field, and just, you're really working on something that's actually going to be implemented. So you really can't mess it up. So, just focusing on that kind of thing, it was definitely an eye-opener for me. In terms of 2019, my heroes, obviously I'd like to say, is my managers. But I think that's a bit cliche in this instance, especially because one of them is in the panel with me. One of the events that really stood out to me that Jody also pointed out was the gender-based violence movement that was there. And I was just, my hero from that came through was the youth, and just the initiative that people took in really speaking up, and that momentum was not lost. And I just hope that momentum is really portrayed in other fields as well, just in terms of planning and architecture, that strength of really powering through and that sort of aspect. My zero necessarily, it's I would say would probably be the academic bubble that I came from in 2018, in the sense that I joined this internship with a full thought out master's proposal and that sort of thing, and a topic that I wanted to do, but really getting into this internship, really like speaking to people and getting to know people and really understanding how uncontextual my topic was, and just, you know, bringing it down to the ground level is there's a big disconnect that we speak about, that, you know, governing bodies don't like, there's a disconnect between the research and the academic work that's done, but I think it's vice versa. I think there's also a lot of research opportunities which don't really dive into the institution's complexities and that sort of aspect. So that would per se be my one big realization that I had in from the year 2019. The lessons that I've per se learned, a lot of lessons, can't dive into all of that now, but one of the biggest things was just being an intern, the difficulty of really asking questions. That was a big challenge that I had in 2019, especially when coming from a student's perspective, where we were in a safe environment to always question things, always, you know, not shy to really approach people, to then be in an intern position in this big institute. You know, you don't really, there's that fear. But one thing I learned is that fear was something that I myself thought of. There are people in the work environment that really want to answer your questions, that want you to question things and want to be part of the conversation that you start. They're so open to talking about ideas, and that's what, yeah, it was very inspiring working field that I was a part of, and it was a good year, and yeah, that's all. Thanks.
Well, you certainly made a contribution in that year, Elisabeth. And moving on then to your left, we have Barbara Southworth. Barbara, this is all news. You're the experienced professional. You know all about all of this. So your 2019, how did it go?
So just bring a bit of a practitioner's perspective. Interesting, this topic, 2020, because one of the things I did when I started at the City of Cape Town more than 20 years ago was participate in the drafting of a document called Future Cape Town 2020. And I woke up in January thinking, oh my God, we've got here, but we're not there. We're nowhere near. And that's probably one of the biggest disappointments for me, starting out with so much optimism and the belief, probably slightly arrogant, that I could really change the world, because that's why I get up in the morning and it's why I go to work, and I think that's why a lot of us do what we do, is because we think we can change the world. So I'm kind of with Jody on, it's really hard to find some happy, upbeat things about looking forward when we're looking at a place where we haven't made a lot of change. I think there's been amazing things that have been done, so I'm not in any way discrediting what has been done in the last. So I'm a practitioner and I'm in the private sector, but I was in the public sector for a long time, and I haven't been able to shake that mindset from my being. I am a public servant at heart. Whoever I'm working for as a client, and there's some here who know how I beat those public drums as whenever I can, and I think that's a really important component. But if we talk about start with perhaps the bad, in relation to being a practitioner in the built environment in Cape Town in 2020 or in 2019, it felt like the year of the race to the bottom. The tender processes, the bureaucracy, the inability to, however well-intentioned officials are and consultants are, it is so hard to do the right thing. And that, I think, was a very sobering component of last year. And related to that was starting out the year with a commission from the city to get involved in housing. And again, slightly arrogantly thinking, yay, this is my turn to have a go at trying to fix housing. Haha. That was also a bit of a bump, because it feels like nothing has changed. Really, nothing has changed. There's great policy, there's lovely talk, there's some amazing documents around, but what gets delivered on the ground is exactly the same. We got rain, and our JoJo tanks got filled, and hopefully all of us are still showering into buckets and still have our JoJo tanks functioning.
Oh, many JoJo tanks.
Many JoJo tanks. Some people made a lot of money out of our JoJo tanks. And I think another thing that happened in the last year was just having some first-hand experience, and again across the board, across public and private sector clients, is the growing appreciation for the role of design in the built environment, which is something that I'm obviously quite passionate about. And then having some really amazing experiences in small municipalities and finding some superb hidden gems. So that was a big up. Who was my hero and zero? I was going to say get all kind of philosophical and academic and talk about Kate Raworth and donut economics and how that's kind of opened up my mind to think about the way the world works and climate change. And then my zero was going to be, for the same reasons, Donald Trump and everything he represents. But then I had my sort of slightly more cynical self was to say my heroes were, sad to say, my private clients, which is hard with my public sector heart. And my zeros were the public sector clients, unfortunately. A, putting out massive, complicated tenders and then cancelling them. B, talking, getting you in rooms to do lots and lots of stuff and then not delivering and not being willing to change. And I get that there's a context and it's hard from inside to do that. But lessons learned. It's been very refreshing to work in small municipalities and with passionate young, really incredible young professionals. It's also been great to work outside of South Africa, sad to say, but it is easier and you can make more. I feel like I've been able to make more of an impact outside of South Africa than in. Another big lesson learned was that if something hasn't changed, there's probably a good reason, and it's not because no one's tried before. So yeah, a bit of a humbling experience in that sense.
Barbara, thank you very much. So, Lwazi, you're representing the activist wing, but you're going to do it from within the public sector. Does that sit well with you, sir? It's an easy gig, right?
It's actually quite difficult. Getting a brief last minute and then speaking last. So it's quite a challenge. However, I would like to say thank you very much for the opportunity initially. For me, one of the good things was that in the State of the Nation address, an agenda was set whereby the state-owned land will be made available for human settlements. That was a good thing for me. And it didn't end there. There's also an interministerial committee on land reform that was established, chaired by the Deputy President, which has actually identified pieces of land whereby municipalities, provinces, and HDA were involved. Some of those pieces of land, I believe that the list has gone to the cabinet. We're just waiting for the cabinet decision in that regard. That makes that committee, for me, the heroes. I think also the other issue that was good for me last year is actually having activist organizations using legislation to make government accountable. That for me is something that is good, because in the past there was no legislation that empowered them, but now there's legislation, which means that there needs to be a renewed social compact with stakeholders. The other good thing is that there was a realization in human settlements that you cannot necessarily divorce human settlements and spatial planning. This has been done through the gazetting of priority housing development areas in August last year, whereby the National Department is looking at spatial targeting for human settlements, basically aimed at ensuring that there's a special transformation. This means that the national government is saying that we would like to target these areas where we would have resources invested in these areas, whereby we'll have integrated human settlements in this. However, having said that, I think one of the most challenges is that there's still a lack of clarity in terms of urban land reform, in terms of who is supposed to take lead. Is it human settlements? Is it CoCT? There's still no clarity in that regard. There's also a lack of clarity in terms of policy and funding framework, because we still have the old funding programs in terms of the national code, in terms of the housing code. Hence, we see the same product as Barbara has said so. Because it's difficult for human settlements, particularly municipalities, to provide funding for alternative building technologies. It's difficult to provide funding for high density, because as soon as you have a sectional title, as soon as you go high, the Sectional Titles Act kicks in, and we don't have any legislative framework that or policy framework that we can follow in that regard. What was bad for me is lack of stability generally in government. You can talk about the city stability, which delays progress. There's been instability at human settlements. So generally, when you're looking at institutions that are supposed to champion the agenda of spatial transformation and also delivery of basic services, there's been lack of stability in that regard. Also, that stakeholders, particularly in the housing sector, are talking past each other. There's no alignment between what the private sector is doing, civic organizations, and also government. And maybe this has actually resulted in breakdown in the social compact. And from a government perspective, it has resulted in non-adherence to the Batupili principles. This has resulted mainly in massive land invasions, particularly in Khayelitsha, where people have also invaded floodplains. Now we have to deal with it. Secondly, PRASA has lost a staging yard in Philippi, and this is mainly because people do not know exactly what are the plans of government. There seems to be a lack of communication between government and the citizens. And the other issue for me, which was actually bad, is the deteriorating public transport service, particularly in the city of Cape Town. With PRASA closing the central line, my city closing the central line, it's the same line because it's Khayelitsha and Mitchell's Plain, and now people have to spend a lot of money utilizing taxis. If one can go to the taxi rank in peak hours, people knock off at 5, they get home at 8. So we need to up our game there. And also, I think maybe we need to properly conceptualize what do we mean about urban land reform. Once we properly conceptualize what do we mean about urban land reform, what do we want to achieve, and then we can come up with what we want to implement and where are we going to get the money that can lead to the changes in the funding framework.
Thank you, Loazia. So, thanks for coming in at the last minute and giving us that reflection on 2019. What I would like to do now is, given that each of our panelists have had their turn to reflect on the year, is to open it up. Take 2 or 3 hands if you'd like to state who you are, what you sort of representing. What was your take on 2019?
Yeah, I would just like to agree, particularly I think with Barbara. My name is Cindy Postwaite. I work primarily in the heritage sector, but it intersects a lot with the state, governance, planning, and so on. I found last year particularly extraordinary because, in fact, it was probably one of my best years in my professional career. And I believe that was because, bizarrely, despite the circumstances, there are people who are incredibly optimistic about the economy and about the country, or they're prepared to take risks. And that is primarily in the private sector. It's not necessarily a good thing. You know, it's kind of one of those heroes and negatives as well. But I found that was an interesting aspect of last year, and I found the public sector's response to the country's crises really depressing. I've also been involved in the public sector for many years. It's overwhelming, and I don't know anybody who read Chippy Olver's book, The City Divided, about the city of Cape Town, which I thought was amazing. I thought it was a very articulate, clearly expressed understanding of a lot of the complexity of the public sector, but also where it's failing. The other thing which I found really interesting, which is really related to some of the projects I was working on, is how in a situation where there are such extraordinary negatives, what is also really positive is the role of activists. And I just felt that at a number of levels, and for me it relates to sort of intangible heritage and resurgent movements and so on, that they have played a very significant role in getting people to sit up and listen. And I think, again, it has both very positive and very negative aspects. But I felt that sometimes people just need to stand up in a situation where things are impossible and say, we want to make a difference. And I think that's happened in various municipalities where local citizens and engineers have just gotten it together to go and sort out the water, And I think that's an amazing thing, where people simply just start to say we've got to make a change. We can't wait.
Thank you for that contribution.
Hello, everyone. My name is Kokon Kalashe. I'm a small-time entrepreneur in the township of Guruletu. And 2019 was thing for a lot of us who are trying to do something, transforming the townships to unearth this supposedly sleeping giant called the township economy. We look at the Sowetos and other spaces in other provinces and with envy, and we see the city of Cape Town not much leading in that space. And I don't know what it is. So my interest here is to see how this special transformation is supposed to encourage your entrepreneurs in situations like that, unearth the economy, as I said, in those spaces, and also deal with the anti-transformation bylaws. Somebody here mentioned the free for all, and I saw that happening in front of my eyes. People sort of opening spaza shops, fixing their cars in front of residential areas, and nobody just seems to care. You know, how does the city and also the professionals like yourselves engage with entrepreneurs trying to understand what is it that they want to achieve, where do they want it to happen, and how it can help close the gap between city, the big center of the city, and the townships, and what economic opportunities lie in between.
Thank you for that contribution. We'll take our last input and then we're going to start thinking ahead to what lies ahead for us in the next 11 months or so.
Hi, I'm Albert Ferreira and I work in the policy space in the city of Cape Town. Just something that we've been dealing with, it doesn't really matter which policy space it is, but it's the question of whether the city should remain aspirational or really focus on doing the basics. And just taking the transport example, we're currently struggling with the BRT rollout and the operational phase of it, but at the same time we are doing a business case study on taking over the rail. And so the question is, and I'm sure there's a myriad of other potential areas for that question is, can the city still be aspirational, and should it, or is there perhaps a broader approach in mentioning the resilience strategy, where it was really not particularly about what the city can do, but what the city as a whole, including all of the partners, can do together? So it's sort of a question we've been struggling with. Personally, I believe we should still be aspirational, but I put it to other people too.
Albert, I think it's an interesting point, and if we go back to the State of the Nation address, which was mentioned from our panel, the president was in his speech talking about this idea of a new city and talked about this aspiration of fourth industrial revolution, and we seem to have been roundly slated for that, particularly from within the built environment profession, rightly or wrongly. So, clearly what you're describing there, whole question of aspiration, is it just about the city, it's about the province, it's about the country, and in terms of the whole international perspective. Thanks for that point. What I'm going to suggest we do is we move on to, as I say, the future, as in what's left for us in 2020, and it's not only 2020, it's obviously the start of a new decade. If you think back to 2010, pretty cool, right? I certainly remember it being an extraordinary time within the South African history timeline. Very exciting time, hugely progressive in terms of the infrastructure that was going in. Clearly money was not an issue at that time, and clearly what FIFA were asking for and how that married with our vision of spatial transformation at times might have got confused, but an exciting time. And here we are 10 years later, and from what we've heard from our panelists and from the conversations that we've had, it's difficult to find, are we actually in the same country? Are we at the same rhythm, the same places? The infrastructure is 10 years older, but the challenges seem 10 times greater. So the challenge for our 5 panelists here, and then we'll bring it back into the audience, is to say, well, what's on the horizon? What is it that we have to look forward to? Because if we continue on the same basis that we've heard in terms of 2019, it's going to be a problem come this time next year, I suggest. But Jody, do you want to kick us off in terms of where you think we're going? Be delighted to hear what your thoughts are, what excites you, what do you think the biggest opportunities are, what are the challenges that might hamper some of those opportunities?
Sure. So I completely agree with the idea that we could just muddle through 2020 in the same way that we have been doing. And not only will we be in a worse off position at the end of 2020, but come 2030 or 2040, we'll be in a significantly worse off position. Going back to my kind of trends at the beginning, technology, climate change, migration, we've heard others around the table of affordability crisis and that sort of thing facing our cities. We really have to paint bigger pictures of what the future holds, including the dystopian, scary versions of that, and start to act strategically now to prevent those dystopian futures from happening. And that's different to a plan or a vision, and it's different from just continuing with business as usual. I really relate to Albert's kind of question around, well, how aspirational can we be, given that we really are struggling to just get the basics right and kind of sometimes feels like the walls are crumbling in around us. And I think, again, that's a question that should be answered quite strategically. And we've got local elections of 2021 coming up. Our IDPs of all our cities will be reviewed at that stage. A lot of the cities are embarking in long-term 10, 15, 20-year planning processes across all their sectors. And I think these are questions that we can start to pose to them, is how much of our budget, how much of our institutional capacity, how much of our engagement time and all of that should be dedicated to just maintaining things. And if we don't just maintain things, what's the implication? How much of it has to be dedicated to just complying with legislative requirements, and how much wiggle room do we have to influence some of that? And how much should be dedicated to bigger, bolder, strategic investments and changes and shifts? And for the latter, what is required of us to be able to do that? If we're acknowledging that we don't have the capacity to even just run what we already have, how do we bring in additional capacity and resources from the private sector, from community sectors, by shifting things a little bit? I'm not talking about another restructuring. Changing relationships internally, to make sure that we've got some people who've got an eye on the longer game, and some people who are really thinking about these shifts and these changes, and making sure that we've got dedicated resources into long-term infrastructure. Rail isn't going to be devolved if it's like a tenth of a person's job to lobby for that to happen. It needs to be a whole team of people whose full-time job it is to work on that process, and what happens to build the institutional capacity to run it, and what happens with all the land that comes with it when rail gets devolved. That's not going to happen kind of by accident. So we need to look at as citizens, beyond just our professional roles in our IDP process coming up, make sure that there's a balance of kind of maintain and keep the basics right, and some of these bigger, more strategic things also getting investment. Our financial models, our revenue models will have to change. A lot of citizens are getting quite upset about how costly it is becoming to pay for services and rates and things like that. We have to have new models of financing and delivering services through a greater network of providers, rather than holding on to everything as the state. Some of the things that really excite me in the near term, a lot of them have been mentioned. The processes around housing strategy and linking that to new policies and new spatial forms. I think it's really exciting. The team of people that are working on that are really passionate and competent people, and they've done a huge amount of getting through the trenches over the last 18 months. I think 2020 holds a lot of potential for seeing some of that come to fruition. The district plans in particular for me are a very good opportunity. We for a long time had a metro scale plan and a lot of vagueness about how that lands. And in my opinion, that's partly the cause of how much contestation we have on individual sites. And if we start to get a clearer plan at a neighborhood level, we might shift some of that contestation and debate in the public sphere about where should there be affordable housing, where should there be green spaces, where should there be commercial spaces, to that level, and not be kind of fighting over each individual site, and is this the last site for me to have my green space or my house or whatever it is. I think another thing that's exciting for me is the way in which the nature of international development and aid is shifting and changing. We went through like a period where there was a dry up of pure aid coming to South Africa because we were seen as kind of too developed. That's shifting now to a re-entrance into our market of aid, but it's much more about compacts and relationships and trade and development, and and kind of direct investment and capacity building. So I think that's an interesting space to watch over the next few years and see how we make use of that strategically locally. And there's a couple of big projects in Cape Town. The airport expansion is quite a big one that will inject a huge amount of money into our local economy, give some stimulus to the construction sector. I want to see where that all kind of goes. The township development for me is a really interesting one that's suddenly on the table a lot more in Cape Town, and I hope to see a lot more kind of real projects on the ground, not just plowing the soil without planting any real seeds there. And then for me, another really interesting thing is that the so-called born frees are those who are not unemployed very firmly in the job market and in the political space. And I think that holds a lot of potential for kind of shaking things up, disrupting things, bringing in new ideas, and possibly even new political and civic movements, which I think is really cool.
Thanks very much again, Jody. Much appreciated. So, Francois, no doubt you'll have a whole range of tables and graphs and so forth, forecasting ahead, talking to the soothsayers in the property world.
As an economist, my union requires me to show graphs. But
so, what do you see coming, sir?
I'm particularly excited about the technology that is going to influence our cities, property markets in them, and the economy. You believe in Hernando de Soto or you don't. But I think, the old adage that a house is a shelter, it's a place from where we derive economic benefits. But it's also an asset. And I still believe that we deny too many people in this country property as an asset. We just don't allow them to play the property market because we can't get the title deeds done. It's all too difficult. The lawyers find it too difficult to handle, too expensive. And I think that where I'm excited about is that the introduction of blockchain technologies for 50 cents a piece, we should be able to give people their title deeds and avoid denying them their opportunity to benefit from the property market. The property market gets played by certain players and not by others. And I think that I do see as the positive side. And again, putting my hat on, I'm also excited whether the farmer in Limpopo wants to do it, whether the farmer in Limpopo to a crypto property and others will be able to buy 1/1,000,000th of the Cavendish shopping center for 10 rands or something. And so I think that the technologies that are coming our way is something that over the next few years, which interests me. I think it offers improvement to access to the city. I think we still have a form of access to the city around transport, getting you there. I think access to the city. Of course, those are important issues, face-to-face contact of people. But I think access to the city will be on the internet, on the cloud technologies, whether you call them techno cities, innovation cities, whatever you want to call them. I think that they offer an opportunity to serve inhabitants. Talking about that, I'm a bit nervous about the new cities that we're supposed to build. The other day I gave a cartoon. One of them had that city. What was that cartoon city on the African cities? Leopard. What was that? I can't even remember. Yes, Wakanda. And one of them had Tartu City or some other development somewhere across. Couldn't quite make the difference which one was real and which one wasn't. So what I'm saying, yes, we need to get beyond the pictures, but aspirational is good, but aspirational for whom? I would like to see the Century Cities and the Melrose Arches being brought down a few notches in South Africa, and I think that we're not cracking that. We're not cracking that homework, play, education game at the lower end of the market. So I do believe that with technology, I'm excited that we can do something very different. What excites me less is that most of the models I'm teaching at universities now, which rely on models on distance and transport costs, are probably going to fall apart. I hope I can still use them for the next few years before I retire. But I'm sure that's something else.
Self-interest there.
Yeah, I know there's a bit of self-interest, and those yellow sheets of paper are starting to. Yeah, I hope to use them for a few more years. But anyway, no. Look, how we think about property markets, how they function, who they function for. I think we have an opportunity that we either take or we don't. What am I nervous about? totally about the economy. I think that let me put it this way. If we have another Zoomer experience in this country, we're done for. We've had it once. We got through it now. Let's hope that this will hold, which is also sometimes being questioned. But if this doesn't hold, and we go back to a similar scenario, I don't see us coming out of it in any positive way. And that's maybe what does make me nervous. What makes me nervous is municipalities that are going financially under. The expertise are not there. The point made becomes free for all. I do tend to believe in free markets, but I also believe that there's market failure, but there's public sector failure as well. We would like to harp on market failure, but the public sector fails at some point, and that leads to all sorts of problems. What makes me nervous as well is that last year 90% of all capital raised in the real estate sector in South Africa went overseas. 90% of it was not invested in this country. And we ended up, and you may say, well, it's a different part of the market, but it ended up in Romania, Montenegro, and many other places that we are not able to hold the investments in this country. And as somebody said to me, if you go to London, you're just about invited by the mayor for dinner. Here, you walk into an office and you're told to go away and please fill in the form, and we'll have another chat some time ago. And I think with that sort of sometimes business, anti-development attitude, I don't believe that we're going to go very far. Great opportunities. I've discussed some of them. Again, the property economist in me, forget the commercial property market at the moment. Retail, forget that unless you're doing something very specific. You can forget the office market. Vacancy rates are the highest across this country. Maybe Cape Town is still okay. But the positive thing, which out of this, is that the all focus is on the residential market, which hasn't been the case for many, many years. Many of the people I speak to, all residential is the name of the game. It's not the name of the game, it's the only game. And so it comes back to the point that I made earlier. Yes, the focus wasn't on residential, on supplying the market. I think we're fundamentally going to change. What I think is also positive, I drive down Main Road. What is happening in those sort of places? I think it's great. I sometimes think that we have a whole system that is stacked against the small developer. The small developer doesn't get an answer, gets a complication, misses a few months, and goes bust. The bigger companies, the insurance companies, they'll blow policyholders' money for a few years and then get through it. We've got to have a system where we can get, if we're serious about SMEs, if we're serious about small business, let's also put together systems that allow infill developments, small developments, and we have a system that doesn't end up. I've got double periods normally, so but let me stop. And okay, let me move on. Okay, thank you.
Liz, moving on to yourself, you've got a big year coming up, both in terms of your studies and so forth. What do you see coming on the horizon from your side?
So I'm particularly interested in seeing all the policies and strategies that, as an intern, we were a part of, how they roll out in 2020, especially Lwazi and Jody mentioned the district plan. You know, it's a different take on how things are done, which is very exciting to be a part of with the public participation meetings and that sort of thing. But also, secondly, I'm going back to being a student with the Sustainability Institute. So, and looking at a topic that was inspired by this internship, which is the inclusionary housing policy. So that itself is a very opportunity. You know, it's a context with a lot of things to explore and that sort of thing. But also being linked to the Sustainability Institute, it's a whole different lens that I'm going to just look into this policy and that sort of aspect. So, but one of the things that makes me nervous about 2020 is that even though this internship was only a year long, we weren't really part of any project that really finished or, you know, closed up. So that was something that, you know, us interns were talking about, you know, things happen, things that are really important, they take a long time, and that's quite, in a way, makes me nervous. And also, you know, it's just showing how we really have to get down to the nitty-gritty of things to implement certain things. So I'm just excited to just take this whole year's experience and, you know, go back to the academic field and that sort of thing. So
Well, good luck with it. All the very best. Barbara, from your side, horizons, new horizons, exciting horizons, or just more of the same and more of the challenges?
Okay, so I'm going to try and take an upbeat perspective on something which I
Thank you.
And people who know me know that I'm quite a big fan of the alarmist doom and gloom, which is always countered with an unending optimism for the possibility of change. So I think what is exciting is that the space created by the precipice that we're on, and I really do think we're on a precipice. I think we've been saying it as planners for a long time. Way back when we were doing Future Cape Town 2020, we said to the engineers, Ron, I think you were there, don't you think we need to think about alternative energy sources? And they said, you planners, we don't have an energy supply problem. We have a distribution problem. Get back on your box. Shouldn't we be talking about JoJo tanks? You're so naive. You should just stay where you are. So I think what's exciting is that I think we are at that place on the edge, and that the potential for us to go very quickly down a very scary non-flushing toilet is quite large. But I think that those kinds of crises create space, and I think the space created by broken institutions, of which we have many, and radically declining public funding. I mean, where are we going to find the money for SAA? 2 billion? I just don't think so. And then if we do, who's going to pay that back? So I think to weigh in on the debate, I think we have to be more aspirational to get through this crisis. And I think that the space that a crisis opens up is to introduce more new mindsets and new ways of thinking. And other people have spoken about technology. I think the youth, activists are all, there's a space in crisis to hear those voices and to allow those people into the debate. And I also think, having spent a bit of time elsewhere in Africa in the last year or so, is that there's a space to learn from war-torn countries that are re-emerging and coming back out of their own crises. And I don't think South Africa is the big brother and the leader in things anymore. I think we've got a lot to learn, and we could put a bit of our southern tip of Africa arrogance away and try and understand what amazing things are happening elsewhere in Africa, business, what's happening in some of the other countries. They're doing much better than us in creating space for entrepreneurs and opening up opportunities. And what makes me nervous is some of the talk today about policies and committees and legislation. I think it creates, and they are breeding grounds for the compliance mentality and silos and the things that are stopping us from doing things. So that would be what I would hope we can move past. Again, I'm not saying we shouldn't have policies or any of those good things, but the idea that those can solve things, my cynical self would question that.
Barbara, thank you very much. We're going to move on to Lwazi. Lwazi, it's silly season between the national and provincial and municipal elections. What's on your horizon, sir?
I think for me, what is exciting is it's actually exciting, and I become nervous when I talk about it and I think about it, is actually the implementation of the district model in local government. What it will do is it will actually ensure that this silo mentality in service delivery is dealt with. I think so, because sometimes you find out that some departments that you do not have provincial departments, where you have regional offices, do not always comply with the municipalities. Secondly, I think it makes me nervous that we are implementing this model. We want to implement this model now because there's a high possibility that it can be politicized and used to centralize power. That's one thing. What also makes me nervous, I think, is elections. With elections, there's always land invasions. And those land invasions, because I believe that parties have nothing to show to the voters that they've delivered across the whole country. Now, we will be talking about the same political rhetoric. We will continue to have policy uncertainty. So that makes me nervous. In terms of opportunities, I think we have an opportunity to talk about to have real conversations on certain issues like spatial transformation, with particular reference to inclusionary housing. And I know that we, as a city of Cape Town, we have started engaging government, private sector, and the civic organizations last year on the issue. The city of Joburg has passed a policy at this point in time, although some of us have got reservations on that policy itself. These conversations then can lead to the renewal of the social compact, whereby then we can work together as government, civil organizations, and the private sector. Hopefully that will actually unlock funding for human settlements for housing, and also provide more housing opportunities to the market, whether you're talking about market housing or state subsidized housing. And also I think one other thing which is for me is an exciting opportunity is the realization by government that there is a market in townships of providing housing. One can think of the Umastandi concept where funding is made available to microlenders. In the city of Cape Town, I think one of the opportunities is the review of the district plans, which actually would be a test of the seriousness of the city in terms of ensuring that there's spatial transformation within the city. This can be done mainly by spatial targeting for different land uses and having local spatial plans that talk to what we want to achieve. But also what is actually exciting for me in that front is that there's also been talks of overlay zones. One can think of heritage overlay zone. One can talk of BOCAP in that regard. And also maybe we can also explore having overlay zones for human settlements, whereby we streamline the land use planning process in that regard. I think challenges we all know is that the economy is not good at this point in time, and the national fiscus is declining, so subsidies will decline for sure. It's the funding for service delivery. In order for us to then improve the lives of the citizens, we need to find new financing mechanisms, particularly for urban regeneration. Maybe we need to look at issues of increasing private sector involvement in areas where there's high risk, maybe by providing certain incentives like the streamlining of the planning process, which plays a bigger role in the bottom line of the private companies. We need to ensure that we have proper urban management in the city at large. I understand that we do have partnerships, certain partnerships. Greater Tagabek partnership, Cape Town partnership, I think Hout partnership. There's a whole lot of them, but the issue is there is, for me, they don't have a clear mandate and objective. We just providing funding, and there's no proper working together with the city. The only thing, those partnerships become political vehicles for certain individuals.
Varghese, again, thanks for those looking ahead in terms of from a public sector perspective. So, colleagues, this is the way it's going to go. I'm going to invite Kathy Stone, one of the sleeping partners of the podcast, to come and summarize what we've heard this evening. But before we do that, from the floor, you've taken the effort, you've taken the time to come out this evening. From your side, in terms of 2020, in terms of the decade ahead, are there any thoughts that you'd like to give from the floor? Any hands? Gentleman in the back there, Nigel.
Thanks, Peter. The question was asked earlier about whether or not the city should be aspirational or delivery driven. And I think that's actually, it's a fundamental problem with the question. We cannot afford to live in a city that isn't aspirational. It has to be that. But you need to temper that aspiration around the delivery requirements of the economy and the population at the time. So you can't throw that away because you want to be aspirational. Okay, right now we have a fundamental problem in the city. We are simply not delivering at any level. At a level of services, at a level of transport. We're pumping raw sewage out to sea. Why is that? Why have we got a problem with that now? That problem should have been solved ages ago. We've got a transport problem. Everybody's talked about the transport problem. We know what the transport problem is. If the transport problem is going to be solved, at least in part, by dealing with the rail, then deal with the rail. Get on top of the My City. If you believe in it, get on top of it. Okay? We have to deliver. Part of the delivery, part of what we're all sitting around in this room debating on a constant basis is the fact that we cannot get anything through the city. You cannot get an approval. Prof talked about earlier about the fact that London, they'll take you out to supper. Here, you get given a form and told to come back tomorrow. We can't have that attitude here. We're way past that problem. We have to deliver. At every single level we have to deliver. We have to deliver with every single small entrepreneur because the big guys are gone. Their 90% is overseas. The 10% here is the guy who can't put it overseas. He's the guy who's building in Khayelitsha and Gugulethu and Nyanga. And he's stymied every single step of the way. The delivery is simply not happening. And it has to happen across the board, in every respect. Then we can get aspirational.
Any further hands, colleagues? You're very welcome. Let's check. Thank you.
I think what I have to say is going to try to connect what the gentleman behind me just said and the issue around aspirations. The truth of the matter is the problem is very, very fundamental. I want us to try to have a thought experiment. Let's assume that we could all have everything that we wanted. Resources are endless. Money is limitless. Would we have the same problems that we have today? Would we have a reason to actually debate and pontificate about certain things? I'm not saying it's as simple as that, but can you just imagine that if we had endless resources? The truth is, even the United States, they complain about failing infrastructure. That's the reality. United States is the richest country on the planet, but they are dealing with serious infrastructure backlogs. Now, what questions does that raise in our minds as planners sitting here? There are people who say Brexit is actually inspired by despondent citizens who felt cheated by the system and felt like they've been marginalized for too long and they are becoming poorer. As a matter of fact, because they felt like the union actually disenfranchised them. Now, what does that mean for how we imagine social compact and planning and the realities of scarcity and what that really means? I'm raising these questions, and it's not because I have the answers to them, but when you think very deeply around some of the core issues, from Chile to Lebanon, we've seen all these uprisings lately, where the society just rises up against the government, to say we demand certain things now. Enough of the pontification. It keeps going back to the same fundamental question: what is wrong with the system? And I'm going to say, I think those of us who have a planning sort of training were trained in the mode of utopia. And that when that hits the reality, something goes wrong there. And I think we need to come to a point where we understand now that maybe this is the norm. This is chaos is what there is. And you just have to find a way to manage chaos. And there is going to be powers and vested interests, and the field is unequal. And that's the truth. As long as you have human beings in that field, it will always be unequal. But the solution also lies with human beings. So if we have the more people, and I'm going to end on this score, from the experience that I've had in Gauteng, basically, the strength of human networks, especially the informal networks, even within the public sector, to actually hone an idea, a vision that is shared across multiple departments, infrastructure, planning, finance, budgeting, people who just own an idea and plug into that vision, no matter how strong the forces that sort of wants to keep the status quo as they are, there always will be small victories here and there. There's power in owning an idea and getting more people plugged into that idea, even though it may be outside of the system. So I think that is where I would just... But chaos, I think we must just accept. That is the norm.
Thank you very much for that. Kathy, I'm going to invite you up to come and summarize now. And then what I'll do is I'll just close off in terms of the way forward and where to from here. Kathy Stone, thank you.
I really don't know how to do this. So we have a colleague who we drink with every Wednesday because we miss him so much. We have to catch up with him. The last time I went drinking with him, he put an idea out there that basically we were in chaos, we were in breakdown mode, and we should really just step back and watch the beauty of it. Watch the beauty of the breakdown and write about it and reflect on it, and it'll be okay because civilizations have done this over and over and over again.
I'm very tempted by his proposition because it's comforting. No, it is comforting. I think my husband's also referred to perhaps we were in the state and we're like the intellectuals of Havana pre-flight. But it did give me pause to think, and I'm not summarizing. I might get to some summary just now. It did give me pause to think that we have because we are humans and we live till our 80s or 90s if we're lucky, we have a very short perspective on our lives here on the earth. I think all of us are incredibly passionate and impatient and exceedingly disappointed because we want this country to be what we dreamed it to be. And we come to forget that we are we're no different to any other civilization and that we are going to go through those same cycles. And Francois almost validated that by suggesting we're in a 70-what year cycle? How many years? 74 months. So we're in an extraordinarily long cycle in the property sector, and I think it might be comforting, although not enough, to see ourselves in a much bigger cycle of the collapse of one civilization and perhaps the emergence of another, which might not meet all our standards, and it may be a lot more chaotic. What makes me think that is that almost across the board of the speakers, perhaps Lwazi's the most optimistic of us all, is that there's an overwhelming sense that people have perceived that the institutions of the country are failing and have failed. The hope they see is in the very small changes, but the momentum those small changes have had, which citizens and activists and individual property developers who still somehow manage to be resilient at this time and are surviving, and the entrepreneurs in Googs are trying to survive, that they are keeping our city going. People, although it's wholly unacceptable and unaffordable, people are still getting to work from Khayelitsha. There is a people system that runs that makes that possible in all its inadequacies. The themes that have come up for me is the chaos is in the public sector, and the institutions are failing or have failed. And I don't get the sense from the speakers that there's any hope of institutional revival. But there's a lot of hope in what the alternatives might be, and which makes me very interested to see what the electorate will demand of the elections and whether we will have our own sort of Brexit. Our electorate are incredibly passive, and it'll be interesting to see how passive they are in this term. Jodie's given us an incredibly broad scope and span of 2019 and perhaps a more local application. Francois has given us a very sectoral perspective on the property sector. A young person going into her studies and in a sense sounds no different from us, and we have to be so careful about how we talk. If some of us have children, we have to be so careful about how we talk because we want them to grow up aspirational at an individual level, and that has to manifest at an institutional level. But we also want them to bath, some of us more often than others, and brush their teeth and maintain a certain standard and go to school proud that they're wearing their uniform. And so it's that aspirational thing, but it's that short-term thing about, well, if they're walking through rubbish to get to school, but you're asking them to dream, how do they do that? And that isn't even the reality of our children, but that is the reality of many children in our city. So I think both enable one another, but I wasn't asked to speak. For the person going into their master's, what's great is that you still hold hope that you can make a difference, and you can, and you will. And those differences actually come in very small packages, and you must remember to recognize them. Because I think Barbara is also talking about how, and even Lwazi's pulled up a number of little things. They're not little, but actually in the bigger picture they're quite little, but they are quite important because they do inch us forward. The inclusionary housing work, Gail, where is she? There you are. It's arduous, but it's inching us forward. The amazing work that the courts have done, as Jodie's pointed out, and the activists have done to actually start drawing some lines in the sand, enabled by our own legislation and the urban, and an overwhelming theme of course, we're all urbanists sitting here in an urban location, so we're thinking very urban. But all these issues are urban, and Lwazi, I wonder if some of these things that are happening, the land invasions, etc., they are urban land reform in a sense, and people are taking things into their own hands, whether they are organized through Ndafuna Kwazi and Reclaim the City, or whether they are through the courts or or whether they're just doing it through land invasions and other things that people are doing, putting up JoJo tanks, putting up solar panels, finding ways to live differently. And I think that living differently is not only informed by the collapse of our institutions in South Africa. I think what people have pointed out is there's a global shift. There's a global collapse of what we're used to and a recalibration. And it never ceases to surprise me that in many ways we're going backwards. We don't seem to be able to get the right lighting compared to when I was a child. Lighting quality is never good because it's sustainable. We're having to put buckets into the top of the toilet and lug water to the toilet to do that, which is just sounds very rural, doesn't it? So but maybe this recalibration of how we live in our society, maybe the last person to comment, it's based on this assumption that we're on this never-ending particular paradigm around progress in civilization looks like. And I think that has changed for the whole world. And I think the speakers have really, really pointed to that. The public sector, much to our disappointment, is not going to be the agent of that change. The public sector's failure is going to be the agent of that change. And that's a cynical note to end on. But it was probably always quite a dodgy bet to rely on the state as our panacea of the answers to everything. And hopefully through this process, the state will become more honest with itself. And we will be able to learn from others and be humble and vulnerable around learning from African countries and learning from activists and learning from people on the street who are making things work and learning from the youth who are thinking about things differently. So not quite a summary, but thank you.
No, thank you, Kathy. As always, appreciate the thoughts and that's sort of bringing us to a conclusion. Colleagues, my last duty this evening is to thank again Ron Hayden and his APES committee, and Soraya in particular, for assisting us here at the Cape Institute for Architects this evening, for supporting the initiative, for taking on the initial approach and the collaboration. I hope this is the start of something, Ron, as opposed to a once-off. To you as the audience, I cannot thank you enough for coming out and supporting something that is untried, untested, but was, in my mind, worth trying, and I hope that this is the start of something that we'll come back to, perhaps on an annual basis, and thank you for your support. Kathy, for your expert summary there and thoughts, as always, hugely appreciated. Looking forward to hearing more from you this year on the podcast. Final word to the panelists, all of you, thank you so much. It's a big, big favor, and I really appreciate the time and effort that you've taken, for the perspectives, Lwazi in particular for stepping up to the last, for people like Barbara and Jody, Francois, and Elisabeth on the first ask, the first request. You were there and you supported this from the very get-go, and I can't thank you enough. We'll continue the conversation, colleagues. All the very best. Please drive safely, and speak to you in the coming few months. All the best. We hope you enjoyed this episode of the Talking Transformation podcast. Please engage with us and let us know your thoughts on this episode. You can do so via the Anchor podcast platform. There's a voice message function available via the app. You can also follow us on Twitter via Talking Transfo and the number 1. So Talking Transfo 1. Our theme music is kindly made available by Tribal Need. Find out about the music, the street art shows here in Cape Town and Europe via tribalneed.com.